guck on the wall struck 2 a.m. The sound was flat, dead, and swallowed instantly by the heavy air of the kitchen. Arthur sat at the table, his weight slumped against the wood. The neck of a whiskey bottle pressed against his lips, but the glass remained dry. He tilted it further, searching for the last amber drop. His hand trembled, a rhythmic, involuntary twitch that rattled the bottle against his teeth. He pulled it away and squinted into the bottom of the glass. The room smelled of stale alcohol, trapped dust, and the sour scent of a space that had not seen fresh air in days. Shadows stretched long across the floor, pooling around the legs of the table. He set the bottle down. It made a hollow, sharp click against the surface. He reached out to steady his grip, but his fingers slipped, sliding across the slick wood. He did not try to catch the glass. It tipped, fell, and shattered against the hardwood floor. The sound was violent in the stillness. Arthur did not move. He watched the liquid soak into the floorboards, darkening the grain. His breath coming in slow, shallow hitches. The liquid pooled on the floor, a dark stain spreading between his boots. Arthur ignored the mess. His focus narrowed to the bottle still gripped in his right hand. He held it upside down, watching the neck with a desperate, fixed intensity. A single, thick bead of amber liquid clung to the glass rim, refusing to fall. He tapped the base of the bottle against the table, once, twice, 3 times. The sound was dull, rhythmic, and frantic. The bead shivered but stayed put. He tilted his wrist, trying to coax the drop into his mouth, but the angle was wrong. His hand shook violently now, a tremor that traveled from his shoulder to his fingertips. He pressed his lips to the opening, sucking at the dry glass, tasting only the metallic tang of the rim. Nothing came. He pulled back, his chest heaving, and stared at the empty container as if it had betrayed him. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. He set the bottle down with a heavy thud, his movements clumsy. He wiped his mouth, his eyes scanning the counter for another source. Arthur shifted his weight, his boot catching on something that crinkled against the floorboards. He looked down. A crumpled envelope lay in the shadows near his heel. He reached down, his fingers clumsy and slow, and retrieved the paper. It was stiff, folded multiple times, and stained with a faint ring of moisture. He straightened his back, bringing the document into the dim light of the overhead bulb. His eyes struggled to focus on the text. He smoothed the creases against his thigh, his thumb catching on the jagged edges of the paper. There it was, bold, aggressive red ink slashed across the bottom of the page. Final notice. Payment. Due in 48 hours. The words seemed to vibrate under his gaze. He blinked, but the red ink remained, sharp and unforgiving. A cold sensation spread through his chest, replacing the sluggish warmth of the alcohol. The reality of the deadline hit him like a physical blow. He read the line again, his lips moving silently, tracing the letters. 48 hours. The numbers felt heavy, impossible, and final. His hands began to shake, not from the lack of drink, but from the sudden, sharp spike of terror. He gripped the edges of the notice until his knuckles turned white. Arthur turned his head toward the counter, his eyes locking onto the neck of a second bottle. He needed to finish it. He leaned forward, his center of gravity shifting precariously as he reached out. His fingers brushed the cold surface of the glass, but his grip failed to find purchase. The bottle wobbled, tipped, and slid off the edge. It struck the hardwood floor with a violent, crystalline explosion. Shards of glass skittered across the kitchen, reflecting the dim light in jagged, chaotic patterns. The sound was deafening in the small room, a sharp, piercing crack that cut through the heavy air. Arthur flinched, his shoulders jerking upward as if he had been struck. He stared down at the debris, his breath hitching in his throat. The silence that followed was different now, hollow and expectant. He looked at his own hands, then back at the mess on the floor. He pushed his palms against the table, his knuckles straining, and forced his weight upward. His legs felt like lead, trembling under the sudden shift in posture, but he did not collapse. He took a stuttering step forward, his boots crunching over the broken glass. He turned toward the hallway, driven by the sudden clarity of the noise. The hallway stretched out, narrow and dark, but Arthur moved with a new, desperate momentum. He reached the door at the end of the passage, His hand hovered over the wood for a heartbeat before he pushed it open. The room beyond was bathed in a soft, pale blue light filtering in from the street lamp outside. He stepped inside, his boots silent on the floorboards. The air here was different, cleaner, still, and devoid of the sharp scent of alcohol. He stopped near the threshold, his chest heaving. In the center of the room, his daughter lay motionless under the covers. Her face was turned toward the window, illuminated by the steady, cool glow of the lamp. She was deep in sleep, her breathing rhythmic and shallow. Arthur stood in the shadows, his own frame looming and jagged in comparison. He watched the slow rise and fall of her shoulders, a stark, painful contrast to the wreckage he had left in the kitchen. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of his own failures. Arthur drifted further into the room, his gaze settling on the desk. A stack of worn textbooks sat in a precise column. Beside them, tucked into a corner, sat a small ceramic piggy bank. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he lifted the object. It was light, unnaturally light. He turned it over, his thumb tracing a jagged crack that ran across the entire base. There was no weight inside, no rattle of coins, no savings. The bottom had been pried open, the ceramic chipped. He held the empty shell, the cold material biting into his palm. This was the sum of their security. He looked at the textbooks, then back at the broken bank, the reality of their situation settling into his bones. He set the bank back down, his movements slow and deliberate, the sound of the ceramic meeting the wood echoing. He stood there, the silence of the room now filled with the heavy, undeniable truth of his own inadequacy. Arthur backed out of the room, his eyes fixed on the floor until he reached the hallway. He moved with a heavy, mechanical gait, retracing his steps toward the kitchen. The kitchen door stood open, revealing the scene he had left behind. The amber liquid in the remaining bottles caught the dim light, glowing with a sickly, inviting warmth. He stepped inside and stopped. The air was thick, saturated with the sharp, acidic tang of spilled whiskey. His heart hammered against his ribs, a rhythmic, frantic thudding that echoed the chaos in his mind. He looked at the table. The glass he had shattered earlier lay in jagged shards near his boots. He stared at the bottles, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The urge to reach out, to drown the crushing weight of the last hour, fought against the image of the cracked piggy bank. He took a ragged breath, the fumes stinging his nostrils, and leaned forward. He stood motionless, his knuckles white, staring down the bottles as if they were his greatest enemy. Arthur reached for the first bottle. His fingers brushed the glass, and for a heartbeat, he hesitated. Then, he gripped the neck, his knuckles straining. He twisted the cap. It held fast, slick with condensation. He dug his nails into the plastic, twisted harder, and the seal snapped with a sharp, dry crack. He tilted the bottle over the basin. The amber liquid hit the stainless steel with a hollow, rushing sound. It swirled into the drain, a dark, viscous spiral disappearing into the pipes. He grabbed the second bottle, then the third. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, saturated with the sharp, stinging odor of alcohol. It rose from the drain, thick and suffocating. He turned on the cold tap. Water roared into the sink, mixing with the dregs, washing the scent down into the dark. He lined the empty vessels on the counter, his breathing finally slowing to a steady, rhythmic pace. Arthur stared at the row of empty vessels on the counter. They were clean, but they remained, a lingering reminder of the night. He turned toward the utility drawer, his movements stiff and deliberate. He pulled the drawer open, his hands searching, until his fingers closed around the cold, heavy handle of a steel-headed hammer. He lifted it. The weight was significant. He walked back to the counter and lined the bottles up in the basin. He did not rush. He raised the hammer, his grip tight, and brought it down. The first strike hit the neck of the nearest bottle. Glass exploded in a spray of sharp, crystalline fragments. The sound was deafening, a sudden, violent crack. He struck again, and again, his rhythm steady and relentless. He swept the remnants into the recycling bin, the sound of glass hitting plastic signaling a final, absolute end. He stood still, his chest heaving, the hammer still gripped in his hand. The sky outside was still dark, but the air felt different. The sun broke over the horizon as Arthur reached the construction site. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and diesel. Men moved in a blur of activity, hauling lumber and shifting piles of gravel. Arthur navigated the uneven ground, his eyes fixed on the site office. He found the foreman standing by a stack of steel beams, checking a clipboard with a sharp, impatient rhythm. Arthur stepped into his path. The foreman looked up, his brow furrowed, scanning Arthur from head to toe before his gaze settled on his face. Arthur did not wait for a greeting. He pointed toward the pallets of cement stacked near the far edge of the lot. He spoke, his voice raspy but steady, demanding the heaviest work they had. The foreman blinked, surprised by the intensity of the request. He gestured toward the cement, a dismissive flick of his wrist, expecting Arthur to walk away. Instead, Arthur moved toward the bags, his stride purposeful. He reached the pallet and gripped the edge of the first heavy sack. The fabric was rough, biting into his palms. He hauled it up, feeling the dead weight settle against his frame, and turned back to face the foreman. The deal was struck in the silence between them. He grabbed the second bag, then the third. The cement was dense, shifting with a coarse, abrasive weight that pulled at his shoulders. Dust rose in thick gray plumes every time he dropped a sack, coating his skin and settling in the creases of his hands. By the fifth bag, his breath came in ragged, shallow bursts. His lower back burned, a sharp, constant throb that pulsed in time with the heavy thud of his boots. He reached for another load, but his fingers slipped on the slick, sweat-dampened fabric. He stumbled, the bag tilting, nearly dragging him down. He caught his balance, teeth gritted, and hauled the weight up with a grunt that tore at his throat. He did not stop to wipe the sweat from his eyes. He kept moving, a machine driven by the memory of the red ink on the notice. The sun climbed higher, baking the site. But he did not slow. He hauled, he dropped, he turned, and he repeated the cycle. His muscles screamed for relief, but he fed them only more labor. Each bag was a debt paid, a physical penance. He was no longer thinking, he was simply moving, his entire existence reduced to the weight of the cement. The gray dust turned into a second skin, caking his face and hardening in the crevices of his palms. Every movement sent a jolt of fire through his joints. He reached for a heavy bag, but his vision flickered, the edges of the construction site blurring into a gray haze. He stumbled, his knees buckling under the strain. In that moment of weakness, the image of the red ink burned into his mind. Final notice. Payment. Due in 48 hours. The stark, aggressive letters hovered in the air before him, sharper than the midday sun. It was not just a debt. It was a deadline for his daughter's future. He slammed his hand against the rough surface of the next bag, the sharp grit biting into his skin, and pushed himself upright. He did not allow his breath to catch. He did not allow his heart to slow. He gripped the heavy load, his knuckles white, and hauled it across the site. The rhythm of his labor became a singular, driving pulse. He was past the point of exhaustion, moving now on a fuel of pure, cold necessity. The sun began its slow descent, painting the construction site in long, jagged shadows. Arthur moved with a stiff, mechanical gait, his muscles locked in a cycle of constant tension. Each bag of cement now felt twice as heavy as it had at dawn. His shoulders burned with a dull, throbbing ache, and his boots felt anchored to the earth by the thick layers of gray grit. He reached for the final pallet, his fingers trembling, but he did not falter. He hauled the last load to the designated stack, the sound of the heavy paper hitting the pile echoing in the quiet air. He stood still for a moment, his chest heaving, his lungs pulling in the cooling evening breeze. The dust settled around him, coating his skin in a fine, pale film. He looked at the mountain of bags he had moved, his vision clearing as the frantic pulse in his temples slowed. His body was broken, his joints stiff, but the exhaustion was no longer a weight, it was a testament. The site was silent now. The work was finished. The foreman walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. He reached into a thick leather wallet and pulled out a stack of bills. Arthur held out his hand, his fingers still stiff from the day's labor. The foreman dropped the money into his palm. It was warm, crumpled, and smelled faintly of tobacco. Arthur stepped into the shadow of a nearby shed to shield the cash from the wind. He began to count. His thumb moved slowly over the edges of the paper. 1, 2, 3. He stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs, and started again from the beginning. He needed to be certain. Every bill represented a night of silence, a morning of school, and a future he had almost thrown away. He reached the final note and pressed his thumb down hard, confirming the total. It was exactly what the academy required. He folded the money into a tight square and tucked it deep into his pocket, his hand closing over it like a vice. He turned toward the street. Arthur moved through the city streets with a desperate, lung-burning pace. His legs felt heavy, yet he pushed them forward, ignoring the protest of every muscle. The academy building loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the deepening twilight. He checked his watch. Minutes remained. He rounded the final corner, his breath coming in ragged, sharp gasps. The lights inside the office were dimming. He saw the clerk standing behind the glass, hand reaching for the light switch, the door already beginning to swing shut. Arthur surged forward, his boots hammering against the concrete. He did not call out. He simply ran. His entire focus narrowed to the gap in the doorway. He reached the entrance just as the metal frame began to catch. He threw his shoulder against the wood, forcing it open, and stumbled into the lobby. The clerk paused, startled by the sudden intrusion. Arthur did not speak. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded square of cash, and slammed it onto the counter. The bills slid across the polished surface, coming to a stop directly in front of the clerk. The clerk stared at the pile of bills, then back at Arthur. The office was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that seemed to measure the final seconds of his struggle. The clerk picked up the cash, counting it with practiced, slow movements. Arthur held his breath, his hands gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white. Every second stretched, a thin wire pulled to the point of snapping. The clerk reached for the ledger, flipped through the pages, and stopped at the entry marked in red. A pen scratched against the paper, a sound that cut through the quiet like a blade. Then, the clerk reached for the heavy rubber stamp. Arthur watched the tool descend. It hit the notice with a sharp, hollow thud that echoed off the walls. The sound was absolute. It was the finality he had been chasing for 48 hours. The clerk lifted the stamp, revealing the word paid in dark, permanent ink. The tension in Arthur's chest collapsed. He let out a long, ragged exhale, his shoulders dropping for the first time in days. Arthur stepped out of the academy and into the cool night air. The city was quiet, the streets slick with the dampness of the evening. He moved with a steady, measured gait, his legs still humming from the day of labor. The path home took him past the corner shop, the same one he had visited countless times before. A neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a flickering, sickly light onto the sidewalk. He stopped. The hum of the sign was a familiar frequency, a siren call that had once dictated his every movement. He looked at the window, seeing the rows of bottles lined up like soldiers behind the glass. The old urge flared, a sharp, familiar pull in his gut, but he did not step toward the door. He watched the light pulse against the brickwork, then turned his head away. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of cold pavement and distant rain. He stepped forward, his pace quickening, leaving the buzzing neon behind him. He did not look back. Each step took him further from the person he had been, his focus fixed on the dark road leading home. The front door clicked shut behind him, sealing out the night. Arthur stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the house breathe. It was silent, but the heavy, suffocating weight that had once filled the air was gone. He walked into the kitchen, his boots quiet against the floorboards. The space was exactly as he had left it, yet it felt transformed. He reached into the cupboard and pulled out a clean glass. He held it under the tap, letting the water run until it turned icy. He watched the clear stream fill the vessel, the sound steady and rhythmic. He brought the glass to his lips and drank it in one long, unbroken breath. The coldness hit his throat, sharp and bracing, washing away the lingering fatigue of the day. It was clean. It was real. He set the glass down on the table, the small clink echoing in the stillness. He stood there for a heartbeat, feeling the chill of the water in his chest, a stark contrast to the fire he had once sought. The kitchen was no longer a place of hiding. It was a place of beginning. He took a steadying breath, his mind quiet, his hands perfectly still. Arthur pulled the wooden chair back, the legs scraping softly against the floor. He sat down, the surface of the table cool beneath his palms. He reached out and pulled his daughter's textbook toward him, the spine creaking as he laid it flat. He adjusted the overhead light, tilting the shade so the glow fell directly onto the printed page. His vision was sharp, the letters standing out in crisp black ink against the white paper. He placed his finger on the first line, tracing the words as he began to read. The house remained silent, but the stillness no longer felt empty. He turned the page, the sound of paper sliding against paper, a quiet, rhythmic promise. He was not just looking at words, he was learning the language of her world. He leaned in, his posture relaxed, his focus absolute. The clock on the wall ticked forward, marking the start of a different time. He read on, his mind clear.